All right, I want to welcome everyone to this week's meeting of the Clyde Sukeforth chapter of SABR. I'm Bruce McClure, the chapter chair, and we always hold our meetings in conjunction with the Gardner-Waterman chapter of SABR in Vermont, Dr. Clayton Truder, chair. Harry Dalton was a front office executive in Major League Baseball for more than 40 years, serving as general manager for the Baltimore Orioles, California Angels, and the Milwaukee Brewers. He was the principal architect of the Orioles dynasty and of the only American League championship the Brewers ever won. In the new book, Leave While the Party is Good, The Life and Legacy of Baseball's Executive Harry Dalton, Lee Kluck examines the career of a trailblazing and prototypical front office executive, and he is here tonight to discuss that work. My good friend Lee Kluck, welcome to Northern New England. How are you?
Not too bad, Bruce. Thank you for having me. Happy birthday for those who
Thank you.
didn't hear it. It's Bruce's birthday today. He's anywhere between 34 and 80, apparently.
That's the rumor. Yes.
So he's that's good. Little mystery is never bad. Good evening, everybody. I'm Lee Kluck. I live in the middle of Wisconsin, which is about as far as from New England as you probably could get. But tonight I'm going to be telling you about a son of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts who spent, as Bruce said, 40 years in Major League Baseball and made quite an impact along the way on not only the people that he knew in the game, but the game itself. And that is Harry Dalton. And so let me just kick into my screen here. And the first question we're going to ask ourselves tonight is, who is Harry Dalton? And Harry Dalton, as I said, was born in West Springfield, Massachusetts in 1928. He was an only child. His father was a salesman for a variety of companies, but most lengthiest period of time, a sporting goods company. His father loved to hunt and fish, and Harry was the same. Harry, when he was not at a ballpark or doing something associated with his own family, was found on a lake somewhere. He graduated from Amherst College in 1950. He opened what I would consider to be the Amherst College pipeline to Major League Baseball, which is still being filtered through today by the likes of Ben Sherrington and others. And he, in his pre-baseball life, Harry was a very intelligent person. He was actually a member of Mensa, and he used that intelligence. He could have used it in a number of ways. If he had wanted to stay, he was a newspaper writer after graduating from Amherst. If he had wanted to stay in newspaper, in journalism, he could have been. I argue he could have worked for the Boston Globe, covering the Red Sox, who were his favorite team. Growing up, if he had wanted, he had originally enlisted in the United States Air Force in time for Korea, became an officer, and was discharged from the Air Force in 1953, and was if he had stayed in the Air Force, he would have been a high-ranking officer, PR officer in the Air Force. He was that type of person. No matter what he did, he would have been successful. He turned his mind to baseball, and ultimately would become one of the most well-known general managers of the 20th century. At least while he was alive, people knew who he was. He won a lot. but he did it in such a way that it endeared him to other people. He was not an egomaniac by any stretch of the imagination. He tried to foster the growth of other people, whether it be professionally or personally. And along the way, he promoted goodwill with the players that he worked with, the ownership that he worked for, and um, the media that covered him. So he got his first job in baseball in the winter of 1953. He's discharged from the Air Force. He went to Baltimore to visit his parents who had moved to the city, and he thought, I'm going to try to get a job working for the new Major League Baseball team in town, the the the, the Baltimore Orioles. He was like I said, he was present at the creation for $45 a week. He he originally interviewed for a job in PR, was turned down for that job, but the PR director at the time looked at him and said, "Hey, Jim McLaughlin in the baseball office, he needs an assistant. Go talk to Jim." And so he went and interviewed with Jim McLaughlin, and Jim McLaughlin, who was one of the only employees that came over to Baltimore from St. Louis, hired Harry Dalton, and Harry really became his right-hand man. It got to the point where when beat writers would ask Jim about certain players in the minor league system of the Orioles, even during the earliest days, he'd look at them and go, I don't know, go ask that new kid Dalton. He knows a lot more than I do. Because he would, he started out moving the names around the board of the baseball ops office and knew everybody in the system. Here's a picture of Harry and in Thomasville, Georgia, which is where the Orioles had their minor league spring training. And it was a formative place not only for the Oriole players that went through there in the 50s and 60s, but also Harry, and taught him a lot about baseball as he got to know some of the guys that worked as scouts for the Orioles, Fred Bootnose Hoffman and Walter Youse, among two of the bigger ones, Ray Scarborough as well, a former big leaguer. So here we go. Here is Harry Dalton, fresh out of the Air Force and in pro baseball. The first picture on the left is, and these are both taken for the Thomasville paper. This is the first day of the first spring training of the Baltimore Orioles in their minor league system. It's Harry and a local woman who was working as his secretary, and his job was to manage all the contracts and things, all the paperwork that would come in, and he had a radio in his office. The Orioles were big on the use of technology, such as walkie-talkies for talking between drills, and the base radio was in Harry's office. And on the right, he is just taking a minute to himself at the stadium in Thomasville, which was on the grounds of the former VA facility. So again, there's Harry as gets a little older, and he made quite the name for himself with the Orioles in the beginning. He was known to have a good sense of humor. He worked really hard. He got along well with the scouts that worked for Jim McLaughlin. At the time, he was the scouting director and the farm director. And they took a shine to Harry. And their biggest in the early years, their biggest goal was to try to set Harry up on dates with the eligible college-aged women of Thomasville, Georgia. He was single for most of his early days with the Orioles, and there was I was told that it was commonplace to try to find Harry a date, in hopes that he would better himself. So I apologize, I've lost my time. Goes by, and Harry Dalton is the farm director through the Orioles system in 1960, and then in 1965 he gets promoted to be the general manager, under and as the general manager, when Lee MacPhail leaves the Orioles, the last thing Lee MacPhail does is looks at him and goes, "Okay, Harry, here's a welcome to the job gift. I've traded for Frank Robinson." And Harry and Harry would have said he had nothing really to do with the trade. A lot of people like to say that that was his trade, and Harry is quick to point out, or was quick to point out before he died, that Lee MacPhail did a lot of the work. He just looked at Harry and said, "Okay, you sign off on it one way or the other." But what he did, and Harry said, it's almost blew the deal, because Harry always believed in having an extra amount of players. He always wanted more. He wanted more pitching. He wanted more slugging. He wanted more speed. So he tried to get an extra pitcher out of Bill DeWitt in Cincinnati, and Bill DeWitt looked at him and said, "No, and if you keep pushing me, the whole deal is off." And at that moment, he stopped bickering over a minor league pitcher and signed himself a Triple Crown winner. They win their first World Series in 1966, and this catapults Dalton into national consciousness. He was even featured in the Baltimore Afro-American as the person, Sam Lacey, the journalist who fought for integration in baseball throughout the 1940s, thought that Harry Dalton was the reason why the Orioles won the pennant in 1966, because he was willing to shake things up. He was willing to take chances with players such as Andy Etchebarren at catcher, and they won their first World Series in 1966. In 1968, Harry hires one of the managers that he had in the minor league system, this little man here in the number 4 jersey by the name of Earl Weaver. And Earl had managed in the minor league system pretty much the entire time that Harry was either the assistant to Jim McLaughlin or the farm director himself. And in fact, his most fondest memory of Earl of that time was when the president of the Eastern League called Harry and said, "Harry, you have to come and talk to Earl, because none of my umpires want to work. And if you don't come get him under control, we're going to kick him out." So Harry flew up to West Springfield, flew to Springfield, which is where the Elmira Club was going next, took Earl out for a beer, and looked at Earl and said, "You will be the manager of the Baltimore Orioles someday if I have anything to say about it. But you will not be the manager of the Baltimore Orioles if I can't keep you in the minor leagues long enough to give you the job." And Earl and Harry worked famously throughout their career, even though Harry was as soft-spoken as Earl was loud. And I asked Harry's wife why that was, and she said for all of Earl's crassness and various other foibles, Earl was really smart. And if there was one thing that Harry really appreciated, it was intelligence. And so he and Earl bonded in that respect. They go on to form probably one of the most productive front office tandems in baseball history, if I'm asked about it. And the Orioles, with the talent they had procured under throughout the early part of the 1960s, went into the late 1960s and the early 1970s as some of the best players, one of the best teams in baseball history. They won a pennant in 1969, lost to the Mets in the World Series. They won the World Series in 1970, and they won the pennant in 1971 and finished second that year to Roberto Clemente and the Pirates, and probably would have won that series if Clemente had not had his national coming out party. So Harry becomes a hot commodity, and during that time, he works on expansion. He works on different issues to have to do with baseball. He was a real deep thinker of the game. They had scheduling issues. He worked on that. He worked on the ties between college baseball and professional baseball, and he helped raise a family. So this is his wife, Pat, on the left, and then Kim on the right. That is Cindy in the middle and Debbie in Harry's lap. And they were all really instrumental in helping me write my book. And the book wouldn't be nearly as good if they had not provided me with that help. And this is a picture that was taken shortly before he left to go to California and work for a man by the name of Gene Autry. Harry left Baltimore in sort of a weird set of circumstances. It wasn't weird, but it was unheard of, really. I liken him to sort of in the book, I really liken him to the managerial version of Curt Flood. Harry felt that the Orioles were dictating to him how and when he would work, and there was a fair amount of paternalism exercised by particularly Frank Cashin. And it got to the point where he said, I want to secure my family's future. I want to go do something. I want to go build. This thing is on rails. And so he takes a job in the fall of the winter of 1971 with the Angels, and will work there until the winter of 1977. They don't win a lot in California. They don't have one winning season in California, but Dalton does lay down the groundwork for future winning by the Angels. One of the things he does is he trades for a fireballing right-hander from Texas who would pitch for the Miracle Mets by the name of Nolan Ryan. And by Nolan's admission, Harry was the reason he became the pitcher he did, because Harry didn't care if he walked 1,000 hitters. He was going to run him out there every 4 days, and he was going to throw. And he said that really allowed him to work on his craft and to harness his abilities. And obviously, he became the best pitcher in Major League Baseball in the 1970s and would go on to a Hall of Fame career and become the all-time strikeout leader. But he, in the 70s, he works through the strike of 71. He tries to be sympathetic to the players' wants and desires. And even on losing teams, people said, they liked working for Harry because Harry was honest with them all the time. Harry would never tell you weren't any good if you were, or he wouldn't overinflate who you were. He would just give you an honest assessment. So in 1977, when Gene Autry decides to go a different way in his front office and try to emulate the Dodgers more than he already had tried to, here's Buzzy Babasi, and Harry feels like he's getting squeezed out. And so he hires on with this respectable young gentleman here on the left in the first black and white picture, Bud Selig, who's pictured with Frank Lane, and who was associate member of the Dalton gang for a lot of years, when an advisor to Harry in both Baltimore, California, and then was a GM for Bud Selig in Milwaukee. And then ultimately he takes the Brewers and turns them into a powerhouse in the late 1970s. capping with the American League pennant in 1982. And they are one of the very few teams I've ever seen get thrown a parade for losing a World Series. They lost the World Series in 1982 to the St. Louis Cardinals. And this is a picture of Harry and Pat at the parade. And Harry said that it was one of his favorite days in baseball to see the outpouring for a team that didn't actually win. But his girls came of age in Milwaukee, and Harry would work for Bud Selig from 1978 until the end of his career in 1994. Post World Series, he continues to work hard, and that even meant making calls on the road in things they called payphones, for those of you who remember, and calling into the office and checking in and making sure things were going right. This one was in Scottsdale during spring training. And he never lost the zest, the zeal to put in the time to work, and neither did the guys that worked for him. Guys like Walter Shannon or Ray Pointevin, they made the Brewers some of the best teams in the American League that didn't win a pennant in the mid 80s. As Dan Evans can tell you, as being in the American League West at that time, the American League East, with Boston and New York and Milwaukee and Toronto on the rise, was not an easy schedule to get through. The Orioles were fairly competitive for most of that time. And so Harry builds a winner into the mid 1980s and into the early 1990s. And he does it by acquiring, these guys were really good at drafting talent and knowing where to find talent. So they had guys like left-handed pitcher Teddy Higuera. They had guys like Dan Plesac. They had guys like Bill Wegman. They had offensive players like Dale Swaim, who was very productive until he had a major knee injury. They drafted one of the last drafts that really came to fruition for Harry Dalton. They drafted a young guy out of Florida by the name of Gary Sheffield, who at the time was a shortstop, and would go on to have a as everyone knows, a substantial career despite the embroilment with the steroid issues and all the things that went with it. And his personal quirks, Harry knew that Gary was going to be a great player. His guys knew Gary was going to be a great player, and he would have been for Milwaukee or anyone. It didn't work out in Milwaukee. There were some issues that he took umbrage to some of the things that Harry did, but those were more generational things. As time went on, Harry, wasn't the young guy in the office anymore. And he even knew that as time went on, he became more and more of a dinosaur. And by the 88 or 89, 90, he was really fighting an uphill battle, but he tried to hang on and give the Brewers a winner. And actually, he was relieved of his position as general manager in the fall of 91, but the Brewers, with a team that he had largely built, won 92 games in 1992 and almost made the playoffs. They were really, really good. And if you question beyond the people that they had in Milwaukee, they really ran into problems economically later in his career. At one point, Bud Selig sent a memo to Harry Dalton, and he said, we need to trim some of the fat in the baseball operations office. And Harry sent him a memo back and basically said, Bud, there's nothing left to cut. I'm working on a shoestring budget. And one of the things, but they continued to draft great players. They just couldn't sign them. So one of the players they signed out of Miami was Alex Fernandez, who would go on to a great pitching career with a couple of different teams. And somebody that New Englanders should know all about, a kid by the name of Nomar Garciaparra, was originally drafted by the Harry Dalton Brewers. And the story was when they were about to draft Nomar Garciaparra, his agent called and says, "Don't waste a pick on it because he's not coming. If you take him, he's going to go to Georgia Tech." And so they didn't, and he went to Georgia Tech anyway and ended up with the Red Sox. But Harry and his guys knew how to evaluate talent, and they just sort of ran out of time in the early 90s. So Harry would work for the Brewers through 1994. He did some of the feasibility work on expansion for Bud Selig as Bud transitioned to the commissioner's office. And to be honest, he was kind of shabbily treated by Bud at the end of his career, and that put a lot of people off, not only in Milwaukee but all over baseball. Guys like Roland Heeman, who had worked with Harry, didn't like how he was being treated at the end of his career. But Harry rolled with the punches, and he worked until 1994. And in 1994, when the Cubs came calling to see if he would become their VP of baseball operations, a job they would end up giving, I think, to Andy MacPhail, Harry said, "Nope, I'm good. I built my retirement home with my wife, and we're gonna move to Arizona, a place that he really loved. He loved the American Southwest, the American West." And so he and Pat sort of became private citizens. The people that from Milwaukee would say that he would occasionally come to spring training games and you wouldn't even know he was there until you'd see him and you'd go, "Well, Harry, do you want to go sit?" "Nah," he goes, I'll sit where I'm sitting and I'll leave. I'm gonna take off." He did some fundraising work. Unfortunately, he developed Lewy body dementia, which is easily mistaken for Parkinson's disease, and that would color his last few years throughout the late 90s and into the early to mid 2000s. His last baseball memory enough was that he was able to see the Red Sox win the World Series for the first time in 2004 since 1918. And Harry was a huge Red Sox fan. In fact, he said his one regret in baseball was that he was never the general manager of the Red Sox. But he took a lot of pride in the fact that two guys that worked for him one was Lou Gorman and the other one was Dan Duquette. And there's a great picture that I love that I wasn't able to procure a good enough copy for the book, but it's Danny and Harry in front of the Green Monster. Well, Danny's in front and Harry's inside the Green Monster with his head sticking out one of the score holes for the tiles. And he always knew where he came from. He loved Massachusetts. He loved New England. He loved Milwaukee. Baltimore was always his town. And he loved the game of baseball, but he knew when it was time to go. And his daughters say that ultimately his decision to not keep working probably gave them 4 or 5 really good years with their dad that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And they're grateful for it. He shaped the careers of countless individuals from Dan Duquette to Dan Evans to countless people you've never heard of. Bruce Mano, who would be an assistant GM with Atlanta. He was the type of person that would, when you caught him on the right day, didn't mind working the office pranks. One day they had an intern in Milwaukee who had kind of been driving everybody nuts. So one day they decided to send the kid down to get the key to the batter's box for the umpires. And of course, he's chasing all over the stadium and back and forth. And he ends up in Harry's office and he has to go into the general manager and tell them that he hasn't found the key to the batter's box and they won't be able to start the game on time. And Harry looks at the kid dead in the face and goes, welcome to the big leagues, kid. You just been had. And the whole office erupted. You know, he once got fined in the Baltimore Orioles kangaroo court because he didn't have his shoes shined. Frank Robinson said, Dalton, we shine our shoes in this organization. That's a $5 fine. And everybody waited to see what Harry was going to do. And Harry got out his wallet and put $5 down on the table, big smile on his face. Guy said they didn't mind when Harry came around the clubhouse because he was not, as they were concerned, he was not management. He was a good human being to work for. And to be honest, he was a good human being to write about. I really lucked out. I didn't find any skeletons that made me go, oh, geez, he was really good at his job, but he was a horrible human being. He was truly a really good human being. So at that time, that is the end of the formal presentation. And you know, if anybody's got any questions, I'd be happy to take them. I'm kind of just more off the cuff in my presentation style, especially at this point. I don't want to give you, there's a rule in public history. It says, don't put a book on a wall. I really don't want to put a book on a wall because I want you guys to be able to pick up the book and read it. So, I'll take some questions and we'll just.
So if you have a question for Lee Kluck this evening, go down to the bottom of the screen and hit the button marked reactions. When you hit that button, you'll see another button that says raise hand. Raise your hand and we will get you in line to speak with our author this evening, Lee Kluck. Lee, I want to ask you, what made you choose Harry Dalton as a subject for a biography? I remember talking to you briefly about this at SABR in Baltimore a couple of years ago, but I'd like to hear you expand on that for a moment.
Yeah,
what made you choose it?
Well, there were two things. The first thing was I was working a day job in insurance that was driving me up the wall. And I had a master's degree in history, and I had a heart attack at 28. I'm 43 now. I had a heart attack at 28 and almost died. Mostly that was genetics. But part of that was I made a deal with myself. I made two promises to myself. One is, if the Brewers were ever to make the playoffs again in my lifetime, I had passed on going in 2008, and I said, if they go again, I will go to the playoff game. Little did I know they would have a resurgence the last, 7-8 years. So I did go in 2011 and was there when they won the NLDS. So I fulfilled that goal. And the other goal I had was to use my degree. And so I was looking for a book to write because work was just bumming me out and giving me way too much anxiety. And so what I ended up figuring out was start thinking about the teams I watched growing up, that generation of Brewer teams right after their World Series appearance. And I said, man, these teams were really good. Why were they good? Because I know they're going to have financial trouble in a very short period of time that's really going to sink the organization for the next 15 years. And the answer I came up with was Harry Dalton. So then the question became is, how'd they do it? And when I started doing the research for the book, it was going to be a very small book on Milwaukee between 1983 and 1992. And it became a much larger book when I found Harry's daughter's phone number in one of his obituaries. And then she started going, hey, you really should talk to so-and-so. Hey, you should really talk to so-and-so. And what you find out is, in the process of talking to all these people that had nothing to do with Milwaukee, his career was shaped by the places that he had been in prior to Milwaukee. And then you find out he's a deep thinker about baseball. He worked on, like I said, he worked on scheduling. He worked on the relationship between college and the pros. He worked on expansion. Bud Selig told me that whenever they had an existential question about baseball, the first people the ownership used to go to was Harry Dalton. He was sort of the big thinker in the group. I would argue that today, if he came along today, he would be Theo Epstein, he would be Billy Beane, he would be as popular as any of the popular GMs of the sport. And that's because he was charismatic and he was friendly and he was good to people, but he was also a very deep thinker about what he was doing. And he was a deep thinker about the rest of the world too. In 1968, the Orioles ended up in Atlanta right the weekend that Martin Luther King was shot. And they had some trouble getting home and they barely got to Baltimore. And by the time they got back to Baltimore, of course, the city was under siege. And that affected him. And then later that summer when Robert Kennedy was shot, person looked at Harry at a ballroom at a get together and said, "Hey, your team won tonight." And he goes, "Yeah, what does it matter?" And he looks and goes, "Well, geez, man, you guys are going pretty good." He goes, "Yeah, but did we really win as a people?" He says, I'm raising 3 daughters, and what are they going to think in a world where you can just shoot somebody if you don't get along with them, or what they have to say. And he gave this big long interview about the world. And so it was just really fascinating to write about him. But that's how it came about, I think, was looking at my childhood through the lens of a professional historian. So
I just looked it up because I thought I was right. And yeah, Bobby Kennedy was shot June 6th. So we just passed the anniversary of that date. Kind of a dubious thought, but yeah, that's very interesting.
And the Orioles were in California that weekend, oddly enough.
Yeah.
They were in California, and it was a hot button topic. And Harry was learned enough to be able to talk on a lot of different things. So it was a really fascinating time. I actually wrote that chapter during the pandemic in 2020 when we had all the civil unrest in this country and all the things surrounding the pandemic. And it was like life imitating art, imitating whatever. I mean, it was a fascinating process, but that's how the project came about.
Glenn Vassy, you're up. How you doing, Glenn?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Bruce. And again, you're doing a great job moderating. And Lee, thank you so much for this book. And since you haven't done this yet, there's a copy of it.
There we go.
Thank you.
Yes. And we have seen that picture because you showed it in one of the slides.
Yeah.
But I have to say, some of you know this about me. I was born in Baltimore and raised in South Jersey from the age of 4 to 12. And I remember becoming an Oriole fan at the age of 9. And I guess probably a few months after I looked in the paper in that April and said, "There's Frank Robinson. He plays for the Orioles. He'll be my favorite player." And then, of course, everything started happening. He won the Triple Crown MVP award, became the first MVP in both leagues, and etc. But I guess I should have known I was going to be a baseball wonk when I started maybe 3 months later thinking about Harry Dalton and what an important part he was of this Orioles success. And it was like, oh my gosh, when I saw on LinkedIn that you were doing this, I got in line. And I'm only about 50.
Thank you.
I'm only about 50 pages into it at this point because I just got it. And it is delightful. You have done a marvelous job. Your work as a historian is clearly apparent. You have done a great job isolating incidents and explicating them and making them part of the fabric of the entire story. So I thank you. And you've given this Baltimore boy who's wearing a Baltimore baseball shirt a great gift, and
Thank you.
I'm very
I'm glad.
pleased to make your acquaintance. I'm done.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank-
I don't take praise very well sometimes, so thank you. I may blush about 1,000 degrees. So I'm glad that
You
you
deserve praise. Thank you.
thank you.
Lee, that's one of the reasons we brought you in here. We wanted you to know how good the book really is. Eric Poulin from my hometown. You are up. Eric, how you doing?
Excellent, Lee. This was a great talk. Thank you so much for joining us. This was really, really super, just informative and excellent. So I have two observations and a question. So, as I mentioned, I'm from the West Springfield, Mass area. My uncle is actually from West Springfield and was only a couple of years older than Dalton, and they played ball together. My uncle played at UMass Amherst. Always said what a great guy he was. Always said just what a nice human being he was. So I'm really, really happy to hear that that's your feedback as well throughout the course of this research. So that's observation one. Observation two, classic barroom trivia discussions whenever they come up about what's the most lopsided trade in history. You know, there's the Jeff Bagwell, Larry Anderson trade. I always go to bat for the trade that Dalton pulled off when he sent from our hometown Holyoke Millers, David Green, Dave LaPointe, Sixto Lizcano, and Larry Sorensen, which are all fine ball players.
Yep. But they're not Raleigh Fingers, Pete Vukovich, and Ted Simmons.
And Ted Simmons. You get two Hall of Famers in one trade. Unbelievable. So that's observation number two. Question three, and I think you may know what I'm going to ask because I have talked to you about this in the past. And I just want to know if you had any insight on this. So one of my research interests is in the very brief career of Dan Thomas, who joined a cult, frankly, the Worldwide Church of Christ after the 1976 season. He was nicknamed the Sundown Kid because his religious beliefs and like prohibited from playing on the Sabbath. It seems like in 1977, the Brewers were a lot less tolerant of this, and that also coincides with the year that Dalton showed up. I'm not saying that Dalton was unfair to him because he was definitely making some pretty unusual requests. I'm just wondering if in your research, the Dan Thomas story has come up at all because it is something that's
not really.
Okay.
Though Danny is known obviously in Milwaukee. I can tell you two things. First off, by the David Green trade that you brought up, Ray Pointevent almost went into a full-blown brawl in a hotel room over David Green, trading David Green to the Cardinals. Ray Pointevent was like, he's going to be this great prospect. Ray Scarborough looked at him and said, "Are you kidding? We can go to the World Series." And when I asked what Harry's reaction was to two of his guys just about beating the heck out of each other, the response was he loved it because he wanted people to be passionate. He wanted people to give their opinions. Pete Vukovich was instrumental in helping me write this book. I talked to Ted Simmons, and they all had good things to say. Ted believes that Harry Dalton should be a Hall of Famer, as does a lot of other people that I talked to. As far as the Danny Thomas thing, I don't ever remember Harry mentioning it like in directness, but I will tell you the thing that Harry said the first time he was introduced to the Milwaukee media. He looked at the assembled people and said, "If you're not a winner, I don't want you here. If you're not if you're not going to take this seriously, I don't want you here." Both Robin Yount and Mike Caldwell said that what Harry brought to Milwaukee was a sense of professionalism. Milwaukee, even up through 1977, was kind of just, we're just happy to be here back in the big leagues, and we'll get our brains kicked in, but we don't care. Outside of a few people, and their real shining moment up to that point had been the fact that Hank Aaron had finished his career back with Milwaukee. But Harry changed that, and soon it if you weren't going to be part of the program there, then you weren't going to be around long. And so I think that had more with Danny Thomas sort of falling out in Milwaukee than his Harry not believing in his religious. Harry didn't care. I think that's the thing that people have impressed upon me. Harry didn't care if you were white, black, yellow, green, orange, Catholic, Protestant, born again Christian. As long as you came to work and you gave him everything he had, he didn't care. And that shows. So
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to order my book as soon as I log off from this meeting. So thanks so much. I appreciate your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Eric, when you get a second, send me an email about your interest in research on Dan Thomas, would you?
Yeah, absolutely. Will do.
Appreciate it. Thanks. So let's flip over to Karen Holleran. Karen, how are you?
Fine. How are you?
Terrific. Thanks for asking. We're glad you're here, my friend.
Hey, hi, Molly. I have a question. Since he's supposed to be a very deep thinker, according to baseball and everything, what would his legacy be?
I think his legacy is sort of twofold. His legacy is actually threefold to me. The first legacy is a legacy of winning. He won a lot. People say, well, he only won 2 World Series, but he won 4 pennants. He was highly successful. He had very few losing seasons. He trained a lot of people that went on to win. His other legacy would be that he was the start of a new breed of general manager. The thought process was you handle everything from soup to nuts. When Harry Dalton took over the Orioles, his number one job was putting a team on the field that was going to win. He let all the other people, all the other experts handle things like marketing and television and all those other hurdles. And his job was to build the team that was going to win. His other legacy is that he was really good to people, and I would argue he was the first players general manager from the standpoint that he was not going to knock down a guy that wasn't that, where some people would say, well, yeah, you had a great year, but this, and now I've got to cut your salary. Harry was tight with the dollar. One time he went around and around. Brooks Robinson told me a story. He went around with him over $500 one year. And he looked at Brooks and said, okay, if I'm going to leave, you think about whether you want that $500. And if I come back and you say you want it, I'll give it to you. But don't forget I did. This is a big thing. So, but players said, Nolan Ryan said that if Harry Dalton had stayed the general manager in California, he would have at least entertained staying in California. The minute he left and Buzzy Bavasi took over, Nolan soured on the Angels because Buzzy was not Harry from a personal standpoint.
Okay, thank you.
And his other legacy, I guess, is just that he was a good person. It didn't matter if you were the lowest guy in the sales team or the 26th man on the roster or a Hall of Famer. He just treated everybody the same. So that to me is his legacy. And as far as the work stuff is concerned, I think he is a Hall of Famer. When you put all of that together, and all the people he trained and all the people he influenced, you come up with somebody that should really be held as under a spotlight as someone to look at historically.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Molly, you're up.
Well, hello everyone, and I'm sorry that Gus was late to the meeting tonight, first of all. Second of all, Lee, I apologize to you because I was late to the meeting, but the part that I heard was absolutely wonderful, and I just wanted to say thank you for coming.
No problem. Life gets in the way. That's okay. You know, things happen. And I'm just glad, good to see you and Gus, and I hope everything in New England is good before winter sets in again. So
We're not going to talk about winter around here, Lee.
Winter is verboten in this chapter right now after what I did. So we're going to back that comment right up.
Did Lee hear what happened to you, honey?
yes, I did. I did.
Oh,
And
okay.
I apologize to you wholeheartedly, but
Thank
you
you.
know, I'm from Wisconsin, where it's always a thought in the back of our minds.
Good point.
In fact, they're under a frost advisory in northern Wisconsin tonight. So
Oh, can you imagine?
there's that.
Can you imagine?
So
Let's see.
thank you, Molly.
Steve Weisensail had a comment. Steve, can you are you there?
Yes.
You're up. How are you?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Lee, for this presentation. I have a question. What was Harry Dalton's relationship with Paul Richards?
Paul Richards and Harry got along really well. As far as they dealt with each other, because Harry was, again, Jim McLaughlin's sort of assistant. But I asked his wife, Harry Dalton's wife, about his relationship with Paul. And they said that one of the reasons that Harry was so successful in Baltimore was that he was able to work both sides of that fence that eventually came up between McLaughlin and Paul Richards. And he worked hard for both people. And so, you know, as far as I've been able to tell from people, I talked to Paul's biographer. You know, he and Paul got along really well. And in fact, it was Jim McLaughlin's honesty with Paul Richards that really kept Harry Dalton's job. Because when they first hired Paul Richards, and he asked Jim McLaughlin what the farm system looked like, and his response was, "It's horse shit." And he goes, and that was an honest assessment, and it literally helped. It literally helped Harry keep his job, and Harry worked good for both men. He would later on, he would hire Jim McLaughlin back with Baltimore, and was always cognizant of the fact that he had success in baseball because Jim took a liking to him, and that was part of the deal.
Okay. Can I just squeeze in
and
one more
was
question?
glad that he did it.
Your first slide, it showed
Yeah.
Harry Dalton in Thomasville, and the major league team, the first spring training was in Yuma, Arizona, and the minor leaguers were in Thomasville. Do you know why that was created that way?
Yeah, so back in the day, it wasn't unheard of to have two different spots. Ultimately, the Orioles would end up in Miami.
Yeah.
But the original one was in Yuma because when Bill Veeck owned the Browns, he had relationships in Arizona. And that's how they ended up in Yuma. And in Thomasville, I'm not real sure how they got to Thomasville, but they had a town that was willing to give them land to work in. So that was why they ended up there. But it wasn't uncommon to have two different spring training sites for the majors and the minors at that time.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Dixie Tarango, you're up, my friend. How you doing, Dixie?
All right, fine. Glad to see Gus tonight. He's looking very restful.
He is.
Lee, it seems like in writing this book, you had a very calm and fun experience. Could you tell us if you ran across anything that surprised you while you were writing the book?
No, actually. I can't think of anything that shocked me. Well, there was one thing that shocked me, and that was when you looked at Dalton's departure from Baltimore, how it mimicked the language that was being uttered at the same time by Curt Flood in federal court. And it's a topic unto itself, and it takes up a fair chunk of the book. But really, Dalton believed that he didn't want to work in a sport where he couldn't decide his own fate professionally. And there was a whole talk about the Orioles blocking him for working for somebody else. And that was interesting, because I had never seen that. We always assume, we've always been taught that ownership was monolithic, that the general managers were completely in lockstep with ownership. And Harry was much more sympathetic to the plight of the talent. That is not to say that he didn't get frustrated with Marvin Miller, but he also really respected Marvin Miller. He was, even when Harry did work on the 1981 strike, he was on the player relations committee. He and Marvin Miller had a very good relationship. And Harry believes that if it had been left to the working group, the 4-man working group of him and Frank Cashin and Bob Boone and Sal Bando, the strike of 1981 could have been avoided, but there was way too much rhetoric being thrown around by ownership that sabotaged that. The other thing that I don't think really anything surprised me. I mean, and that even goes to the interviews I conducted. I was really lucky. The people I interviewed really liked Harry Dalton, and they all had the same sort of, even the people that had arguments with him would say, at the end of the day, he was a really good guy. Dan Evans can speak to this. Dan told me a really great story when I was in Baltimore. We were standing in the gift shop of the Babe Ruth Museum, which is not very large, and I'm a big guy. Dan is not so much, but I'm wide enough to take up, a row house unto itself. And Dan told me a story that, here he is, a young guy, and he's working in Chicago for the White Sox, and he's working for Harry's friend Roland Hemond. And he goes, one day Harry comes over to him and says, "Hey, I was talking to Roland, and Roland says I should take you to lunch. And so let's go to lunch." And he says, Dan learned an awful lot from Roland, and Roland in of himself deserves a book to be written about all the things he did for baseball. But one of the things, he really thought Harry was a great human being. So that was one of the things. I wasn't really surprised after a while, because everyone was so adamant that what they were telling me was the truth, and it was told to me over and over and over and over and over again.
That's fantastic. The book is called Leave While the Party's Good, The Life and Legacy of the Baseball Executive Harry Dalton. Lee, tell us how to find it, my man.
So I will start with the politically correct answer, because my publisher would love me for it. You can go to the University of Nebraska website, publishing, Nebraska publishing arm, and pick it up there, University of Nebraska Press. You can pick it up at any of your major retailers on the internet tubes. And you can also pick it up, if you ask your local retailer to get you one, or if you'd like an autographed copy. I'm even placing orders periodically to do that for people. And there's a little bit of an increased cost because I cover shipping, but pretty much out, available everywhere in both ebook and hardcover right now. So you can find it if you want to, and I really do appreciate it if you spend some of your money on it.
Glenn Vassy, you're up.
Sorry about that. I had to unmute. What's the next work? Are you considering that at this point in time, or?
Yeah, well, yes. I am, and some of that has to do with the fact that this is my primary job now, so I have to kind of keep things in the cycle of working. But I have one baseball related book that I want to maybe do a deep dive on the 1993 season as sort of a watershed to all the things that we would see post 1993. Labor strife, steroid use, big market versus small market, the rise of people like Barry Bonds and Dusty Baker, and sort of the transition of baseball. And the other topic for those of you who are golfers is a look at the 1964 U.S. Open golf tournament, which was played in outside of Washington, D.C. at Congressional Golf Club and won by Ken Venturi in 100-degree heat and humidity in a day and age when they played 18 holes on Thursday, 18 holes on Friday, and 36 holes on Saturday. And Ken Venturi almost died. The doctors looked at him at the turn and said, "You go back out there and play, we can't guarantee that you're going to be alive to finish." And it was the tournament that changed sort of how that was done. So I do have a couple of topics in mind. I'm not real sure. I have to kind of look at sources and see which way there's more room. Obviously baseball is something that I love doing, but I like a good story too. And I like something that'll keep me engaged.
If I
Good
may,
stuff. Go ahead, Clyde. You up? Go.
one quick thing. Some of you are familiar with Jonathan Eig, who is published some wonderful baseball biographies and other things. And I just want to mention that he's just won the Pulitzer Prize for his biography of Martin Luther King Jr. It's called King: A Life, and
Just won the Pulitzer.
won the Pulitzer. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I just wanted to mention that because anybody looking for good baseball books can find them from him, or if you want other topics, he's got that covered. And it reminds me of your interest in history. That's where he comes from. So thank you.
Yep. And so, I think that's the thing. I see myself as a sports historian, but obviously the baseball is kind of where I like to make my hay, because I get to interact with the people here. So
That's terrific. All right. Well, next week, June 17th at 7 p.m., we're going to have Ken Smoller with us. Ken will be discussing his book, Last Comiskey, the companion to the fantastic YouTube documentary that was released last year. You are not going to want to miss out on this one. The 1990 White Sox surprised the baseball world, and their story is fascinating. And Dan Evans is here. He'll tell you I'm spot on with that. Finally, I want to thank
Dan
everyone
looks
for coming
good
out.
in that documentary, by the way.
What's that?
Dan stole the show in that documentary.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. Dan, yep, Dan did. You're right. You're right. Hopefully, Dan will be here next week and he can enjoy that presentation too. Now, finally, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I want to thank all of you who are watching at home after the fact on YouTube. If you like what we're doing up here in Northern New England, please subscribe to our channel to get alerts for each of our weekly uploads. And if you are a baseball fan, you need to join SABR, the premier baseball community, offering an amazing baseball buffet of options to explore your fandom. SABR boasts more than 35 different research committees, over 70 regional chapters, and innumerable opportunities to connect with baseball minds across the world. For more information, go to sabr.org/join today. Lee Kluck, you are terrific. This has been fantastic. A little round of applause for Lee so he can see us and tell him how great he was. So I want to thank you very much for doing this tonight, Lee.
Nope, no problem. Thank you. I'm glad to be here. And if anybody has any other questions, Bruce knows how to get a hold of me. And enjoy your evening.
Yeah, Lee can't hide from me. So if you want to get in touch with him, let me know and I'll be happy to connect you. So we're going to see everybody next week for Ken Smoller. Let's get everybody out of here. Have a good night, everybody.